Relaxing sleep story. Robert Jan and his family. It was 6:15 in the morning when Robert Jan slowly woke up. Outside it was still dark. The street lamps cast a soft orange glow through the thin curtains. In the bedroom, he could hear the gentle hum of the heating. The duvet felt heavy on his legs. He turned over slowly, gazed up at the ceiling, and listened to the quiet breathing of his wife, still deep in sleep. The alarm hadn't rung yet, but Robert Jan was used to waking a little earlier than necessary. This gave him time to calmly think about the day ahead. Slowly, he slid his legs out of bed. The floor felt cold beneath his feet. He tiptoed to the bathroom, where the tiles felt even colder. The bathroom light was bright. Robert Jan looked at his reflection in the mirror. His hair was tousled. He picked up his toothbrush, squeezed some toothpaste on it, and brushed his teeth with slow, deliberate movements. He rinsed his mouth, dried his face with a towel, and walked back to the bedroom to get dressed. His clothes were neatly folded on a chair, a pair of blue jeans, a gray shirt, and a dark blue sweater. At 6:30, Robert Jan walked down the creaking stairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet. The countertop was clean, except for a few crumbs. He switched on the coffee maker and waited for it to start bubbling. Looking out the window, it was still dark outside. A lone car slowly drove down the street. The trees in the front yard swayed gently in the breeze. Robert Jan poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip. The coffee was hot and bitter. At 6:45, he heard the first sounds from upstairs. A door opening, soft footsteps on the landing. His eldest daughter came down, sleepy, her hair messy. She said, "Good morning," took a bowl from the cupboard, and poured herself some milk. Robert Jan poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. His daughter ate her breakfast quietly. The clock ticked slowly onward. At 7 o'clock, his wife came downstairs, followed by their youngest son. The kitchen filled with the soft murmur of the family. Everyone took their breakfast, sandwiches with cheese, a glass of milk, an apple. Robert Jan watched as his family prepared for the day. He felt content. This was his passion, caring for his family, making sure everyone left the house on time and in good spirits. At 7:15, it was time to pack the bags. The children put their lunch boxes and drink bottles into their backpacks. Robert Jan checked if everyone had their gym clothes. His wife quickly wrote a note for the teacher. The children put on their coats, wrapped their scarves around their necks, and laced up their shoes. Robert Jan grabbed his own bag, put on his coat, and checked that he had his keys. At 7:30, the family stepped outside. It was now light. The sky was gray with a light mist hanging over the street. The sidewalk was damp with dew. Neighbors were also busy taking their children to school. Robert Jan greeted the neighbor walking his dog. The children ran ahead, jumped over puddles, laughing at the mud on their shoes. At the school gate, Robert Jan said goodbye to his children. He waved and watched them enter the building, then turned around. His wife kissed him on the cheek and walked back home. Robert Jan got on his bike. The saddle was cold. He placed his bag in the front basket, zipped his coat up to the top, and pedaled away slowly. The bike ride to work was always the same. Robert Jan rode through the residential neighborhood, past rows of identical houses with small front gardens. The hedges were neatly trimmed, the sidewalks swept clean. Here and there, a trash bin stood by the curb. The sky was dull, the sun hidden. Robert Jan heard the soft clinking of his bike chain. A few cars passed him slowly, as if no one was in a hurry on this morning. After 10 minutes of cycling, he reached the park. The grass was wet, the trees stood still. In the distance, he heard birdsong. Robert Jan pedaled calmly, watching the ducks in the pond. A thin layer of mist hovered over the water. Across the park stood tall, gray apartment blocks. Their windows reflected the weak morning light. Robert Jan greeted an old man walking his dog and continued on his way. At 7:45, he reached the bike path along the canal. The water was dark with a single boat moored. On the opposite bank stood large, square factory buildings. Their windows were fogged. Robert Jan cycled slowly, gazing at the water, listening to the soft rustle of the wind. The bike path was empty except for a few other cyclists, all seemingly lost in their own thoughts. After 15 minutes, Robert Jan arrived in the city center. The streets were wider, the houses taller. On the sidewalk, a woman pushed a stroller. A bus slowly passed by. Robert Jan waited at the traffic light, watching people hurry to work. When the light turned green, he crossed and rode onto the town hall. The town hall was a large, modern building of glass and concrete. The doors were still closed. Robert Jan parked his bike, locked it, and walked inside. The lobby was spacious, with a tall glass wall. A large plant stood in a corner. The floor was made of gray tiles. Robert Jan went to the cloakroom, hung up his coat, and walked to his office. His office was on the second floor. The staircase was wide, the steps made of concrete. Plants in large pots lined the hallway. Robert Jan opened his door and set his bag on the desk. It was quiet. He switched on his computer, waited for it to start, and looked out the window. Outside, cars slowly passed by. The sky was still gray. At 8 o'clock, his workday began. Robert Jan worked as an administrator for the municipality. His tasks were always the same: answering emails, checking documents, filling out forms. He opened his inbox, read the messages, and began typing. Each email was short, businesslike, polite. He checked an Excel file, filled in a form, printed a document. The printer made a soft humming sound. At 9 o'clock, he took a break for coffee. The coffee machine was in the hallway. Robert Jan waited for his cup to fill, took a sip, and walked back to his office. In the corridor, he met a colleague. They greeted each other and exchanged a few words about the weather. The conversation was brief, unremarkable. Robert Jan continued on and returned to his work. The morning passed slowly. Robert Jan worked steadily, only pausing occasionally to visit the restroom or get a glass of water. The clock ticked on. At 12 o'clock, it was time for lunch. Robert Jan took his lunchbox from his bag and ate his sandwiches at his desk while watching the rain fall softly outside. People on the street carried umbrellas. After lunch, he continued working. The afternoon was much like the morning: emails, documents, forms. Occasionally, a colleague called with a question. Robert Jan always answered calmly, politely, clearly. The hours crept by. Outside, the sky gradually cleared. The rain stopped, and the light brightened. At 5 o'clock, it was time for Robert Jan to go home. He tidied his desk, shut down his computer, grabbed his bag, and walked downstairs. In the hallway, a faint scent of cleaning fluid lingered softly in the air. He put on his coat, stepped outside, and took his bike from the rack. The saddle was still damp from the rain. Robert Jan carefully wiped it dry with a handkerchief, placed his bag in the front basket, and mounted his bike. The ride home was peaceful and unhurried. Though it was still light outside, the sun was hidden behind a soft gray sky. Robert Jan pedaled slowly through the city streets, passing shops that were just about to close. Their windows glowed warmly, and the sidewalks were freshly swept. Riding alongside the canal, he watched boats gently bobbing on the quiet water. The air was still. The wind had settled. In the park, a few people sat quietly on a bench. Ducks swam serenely in the pond. Robert Jan continued cycling at a gentle pace, admiring the trees that were slowly turning green with new leaves. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the scent of damp grass. He greeted an elderly woman walking her dog and continued through the peaceful neighborhood. By 5:30, he arrived home. The front door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the joyful sounds of children playing filled the house. Robert Jan parked his bike in the shed, locked it securely, and stepped inside. Shoes were scattered in the hallway, coats hung neatly on the rack. In the living room, his children sat on the couch, while his wife busied herself in the kitchen preparing dinner. Robert Jan walked into the kitchen, kissed his wife gently, and asked what was for dinner. She replied that they would have potatoes, vegetables, and meat. He poured himself a drink and sat down at the kitchen table, watching his wife peel potatoes, chop vegetables, and cook the meat. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of sautéed onions. At 6 o'clock, the family gathered at the table to eat. They ate quietly, sharing stories about their day. The children talked about school, and Robert John listened attentively, nodding along. He felt a deep sense of contentment. After the meal, he cleared the table, loaded the dishwasher, and wiped the countertops clean. The evening unfolded calmly. The children played in the living room while Robert John read the newspaper. His wife watched television. At 8 o'clock, he took the children upstairs to bed. He read them a story, tucked them in, and wished them good night. Then he returned downstairs, poured himself another drink, and settled on the couch. By 10 o'clock, Robert John went to bed. He brushed his teeth, changed into his pajamas, and slipped under the covers. The room was quiet. Street lamps cast a soft, muted glow through the curtains. Closing his eyes, he reflected on the day that had passed and slowly drifted into a peaceful sleep. The next morning, Robert John awoke at 7:15. It was a Saturday, and today he didn't have to go to work. Fresh air flowed through the open window, and birds sang softly in the trees of the backyard. Robert Jan stretched, feeling well-rested and looking forward to the day ahead. Finally, some free time. He planned to cook an elaborate Vietnamese meal, adding a little spice to his life, he thought happily. Downstairs, the kitchen was quiet. The children were still asleep. Robert John brewed a pot of coffee and gazed dreamily out the window. In his mind, he made a shopping list. Fresh coriander, lemongrass, lime, fish sauce, rice noodles, chicken, bean sprouts, red chilies, mint, spring onions, and of course Vietnamese spring roll wrappers. He felt almost like a chef preparing for a grand feast. The idea of going to different shops with the children made him smile. He liked showing them where to find the best ingredients. At 8 o'clock, the children came down, still sleepy. Robert John shared his plan enthusiastically. The children were excited to help, especially because at the Asian supermarket they always got to pick a bag of spekek, a layered cake. They ate breakfast together as Robert John explained what they would be buying. At 9:30 they got into the car. The air was crisp and the neighborhood streets were quiet. Robert Jan drove slowly past rows of houses with small gardens. The trees were just beginning to bud. At the corner, he waved to neighbor Else, who was walking her dog. Robert John stopped briefly, rolled down the window, and chatted. "What are you up to today?" Else asked. "We're going to buy ingredients for a Vietnamese meal," Robert John replied proudly. Else laughed. "That sounds delicious. Don't forget the fresh mint that really makes it." They wished each other a good day, and Robert John drove on. Their first stop was the greengrocer at the square. The children helped pick coriander, peppers, and bean sprouts. Inside, Robert Jan ran into neighbor Keys, who was paying for a sack of potatoes. "Up early too?" Keys asked. "Yes, doing something different than Stamp Pot today. We're cooking Vietnamese." Keys looked surprised. "Impressive. I'll stick to kale. Good luck and enjoy your meal." They laughed and said goodbye. Next, they drove to the Asian supermarket on the edge of town. The parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, the air smelled of spices and herbs. Robert Jan let the children find the rice noodles and fish sauce. Together, they browsed the shelves of exotic products. The owner, Mr. Tran, recognized Robert Jan and greeted him warmly. "Good morning. What are you making?" he asked. "Pho and fresh spring rolls," Robert Jan said. Mr. Tran gave tips on the best broth cubes and pointed out the fresh mint by the checkout. The children were offered a piece of spekek. Robert John also bought lime and lemongrass. On the way home, they stopped at the Turkish bakery for fresh bread and a few baklavas for dessert. The baker asked curiously about all the fresh herbs. Robert John told him about his Vietnamese plans, and the baker responded enthusiastically, "Delicious. Food brings people together, doesn't it? Enjoy cooking." Around noon, they were back home. The kitchen table was covered with colorful ingredients. Robert John put on cheerful music and the children helped wash the vegetables. Together, they cut the chicken, chopped the herbs, and stirred the broth. The kitchen filled with unfamiliar, spicy aromas. Robert Jan felt happy and energized. Cooking was not only a way to add spice to his day, but also to create beautiful memories with his family. The afternoon flowed gently. Occasionally, Robert Jan glanced outside as the sun cautiously broke through. He thought about the conversations with neighbors, the joy of shopping together, and the anticipation of a special meal. Today was different, and that felt good. During the night, Robert John dreamed that he was in a vast, mysterious forest. The air was cool and damp, the trees towering high above him, letting only sparse light through their leaves. Next to him stood a bottle of wine, which he carried without clear reason. The forest felt both familiar and unsettling, silent except for the rustling of leaves, and Robert Jan felt completely alone. He began to walk deeper into the forest, hoping to find a way out. But no matter how far he walked, the trees seemed endless. Each step took him further from the known, and slowly he lost track of time and direction. The feeling of being lost grew stronger, as if he were trapped in a phase of life where he had to let go of the familiar and face the unknown. He began to walk deeper into the forest, hoping to find an exit. But no matter how far he walked, the trees seemed to stretch endlessly. Each step took him further from the familiar, and he slowly lost track of time and direction. The feeling of being lost grew stronger, as if he were trapped in a phase of his life where he had to let go of the familiar and face the unknown. Suddenly, strange creatures appeared among the trees, small gnomes with pointed hats and mischievous faces. They jumped out from the bushes, laughed kindly, and greeted him in cheerful voices. Robert Jan felt a little uneasy at first, but the gnomes reassured him. They spoke in mysterious phrases about the importance of accepting help and that you don't have to do everything alone. The gnomes showed him a path he hadn't seen before. They walked with him, joked, and told stories about the forest and its secrets. As they walked together, Robert Jan noticed the forest slowly growing lighter. The trees parted and sunlight broke through the canopy, making the path clearly visible. With each step, he felt less lost and more connected to himself and his surroundings. At the edge of the forest, where the light shone brightly and the air felt warm, the gnomes said goodbye. Robert Jan walked on and saw his wife and children standing in the distance, beaming with joy. They waved at him, and he felt a deep relief and happiness. The dream ended with a feeling of coming home and gratitude for the people who help him, both in dreams and in real life. On Sunday morning, Robert John suddenly woke up. It was 8:45. He was startled. Normally, he got up much earlier, but now he had overslept. The house was already filled with the sound of children giggling at the table. In the kitchen, his wife was busy baking pre-made rolls and pouring orange juice. The smell of fresh coffee and warm rolls filled the house. Robert John hurried out of bed, quickly dressed, and walked downstairs, where his family greeted him cheerfully. During breakfast, his wife told him that they would all go to the beach today. The children were immediately enthusiastic and began making plans about building sandcastles and searching for shells. Robert Jan felt relieved that despite oversleeping, he was still on time for the family outing. After breakfast, they packed the beach gear together: towels, buckets, shovels, sunscreen, a cooler with sandwiches and drinks. Around 10:30, they got into the car. The sky was lightly cloudy, but it promised to be a beautiful day. On the way to the beach, they drove along the highway toward the coast, but soon they noticed they were not the only ones with the idea to go to the sea. Traffic slowed and they gradually got stuck in a traffic jam. Cars full of families were in front of and behind them, bikes on roofs, windows open, children impatiently looking out. Robert John sighed, turned on the radio, and tried to keep his patience. After a while, the children started to grumble, but his wife pulled games from the bag. "I spy with my little eye," and riddles about everything they saw outside. This made the traffic jam a bit more pleasant. although it took more than 3/4 of an hour longer than planned before they finally reached the exit to the beach. Arriving at the beach, they parked the car and walked, laden with gear, toward the sea. The sand felt warm under their feet, and the children immediately ran ahead. They found a spot among the dunes to lay down their things. Robert John set up the parasol, his wife applied sunscreen to the children, and then the fun began. The children built a huge sandcastle together with moats and towers, decorated it with shells and pieces of seaweed. They ran to the surf, jumped over the waves, and collected the most beautiful stones. Robert John watched, took photos, and occasionally helped dig a deep hole. His wife read a book and enjoyed the sunshine. Occasionally, a cooling breeze came from the sea. Between playing, they ate their sandwiches and drank lemonade from the cooler. Toward the end of the afternoon, around 5 o'clock, they packed up again. The children were tired, their hair full of sand and their cheeks red from the sun and exertion. On the way back to the car, they trudged slowly through the soft sand. In the car, the children almost immediately fell asleep, drowsy from a day of playing outside. The return trip went smoothly. There was no traffic jam, and the family enjoyed the quiet and the afterglow of a successful day. Arriving home, everyone helped unload the car. The children took showers to wash the sand from their hair. Robert John made tea and cut some fruit for dinner. After dinner, they prepared for the night, pajamas on, teeth brushed, and a little chat about the day. In bed, Robert Jan told the children a short story about gnomes on the beach, after which they quickly fell asleep. Robert John walked quietly through the rooms, looked at his sleeping family, and felt content. It had been an ordinary Sunday, but it was precisely those ordinary days that made him happy. Monday morning. Robert John woke at 7 o'clock. The first rays of sunshine fell through the curtains, illuminating the bedroom with a soft yellow light. He felt sluggish from the weekend, but knew duty was calling again. In the kitchen, he heard his wife already bustling about. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the house. The children sat at the table, still a bit sleepy, their hair tousled. Robert John greeted everyone, grabbed a sandwich, and drank his coffee in silence, mentally preparing for the new work week. At 7:45, he put on his coat, placed his bag in the bike basket, and got on his bike. The air was fresh, the streets still quiet. As he rode through the neighborhood, he noticed how the dew lay like little pearls on the grass. The trees stood neatly along the sidewalk, their young leaves shining in the morning light. On the bike path along the park, he suddenly heard a loud chatter. Above him circled a large flock of starlings, their wings fluttering like a moving carpet in the air. Among the starlings, he also saw a group of jackdaws, with their characteristic silvery gray heads and sharp, alert eyes. The birds seemed to follow him, as if they had taken over his rhythm. Sometimes they landed on a lamppost, only to fly away again as he approached. Robert John smiled. It was as if the birds accompanied him on his journey to work. Along the canal, the water was smooth as a mirror. In the distance, he saw a heron standing on the bank, motionless, waiting for prey. The starlings and jackdaws fluttered around him, their song mingling with the soft rustle of the wind and the gentle ringing of his bike chain. It felt almost magical this morning, full of birds, as if nature was giving him encouragement for the day ahead. Upon arriving at the town hall, Robert John parked his bike in the rack. The starlings and jackdaws lingered nearby for a moment as if to wave him goodbye before flying off in one smooth movement. Inside the building, Robert John immediately felt the weight of the work week on his shoulders. His inbox was overflowing, files piled up on his desk, and a list of tasks awaited him that seemed longer than ever. For a moment he felt overwhelmed, but his colleagues noticed. They offered help, took a few tasks off his hands, and together they slowly worked through the pile of work. At midday, he drank coffee with them. They laughed at a joke, and Robert Jan felt supported. The day progressed steadily, and the work became lighter through collaboration. At the end of the afternoon, he felt surprisingly refreshed. He got back on his bike, this time heading toward his children's school. The sky was clear blue. The starlings and jackdaws had disappeared. but their cheerful presence still seemed to echo in his thoughts. At the school, his children were already waiting for him. They ran up to him, eagerly sharing stories about their day, and together they cycled home. Once home, it was Robert Jan's turn to cook. Everyone gathered in the kitchen, the children chopped vegetables, Robert Jan cooked the meat, and his wife set the table. It was a simple but cozy meal. After dinner, the children helped clean up. Then it was time for the evening routine. Brushing teeth, putting on pajamas, and sharing a quiet moment together in bed, talking about the day. Robert Jan read a short story, tucked the children in, and wished them good night. When the house grew quiet, Robert Jan climbed into bed himself. He thought back to the birds from that morning, the teamwork at work, and the joy of being with his family. Content, he drifted off to sleep, ready for a new day. That night, Robert Jan lay awake for a long time. His thoughts kept returning to the starlings and jackdaws that had seemed to follow him on his bike ride that morning. When he finally fell asleep, he was soon swept into a vivid dream. In his dream, Robert Jan cycled again through the morning light, but the surroundings were strangely silent. Suddenly, a group of starlings landed on branches along the path. They looked at him with sharp, glittering eyes and began to whisper. Their voices sounded harsh and unfriendly. "What are you doing here, Robert Jan?" they hissed. "This is our territory." The starlings drew closer, their wings fluttering threateningly. Robert Jan felt uneasy and tried to keep cycling, but the starlings circled him, trying to peck at him with their beaks and claws. Just as panic began to rise, a group of jackdaws appeared. With their distinctive pale eyes and social, protective nature, they formed a circle around Robert Jan. The jackdaws spoke in gentle voices. "Don't worry, we are with you." They kept the starlings at bay, their presence strong and reassuring. The starlings tried to threaten once more, but the jackdaws chased them away with loud caws and swift wing beats. Robert Jan felt safe among the jackdaws. They guided him further along the path, away from the threatening starlings. Their company was warm and familiar, as if they protected him as they do in their own flocks. The tension eased, and Robert Jan felt relief. Suddenly, he awoke with a start. His heart raced, but he was glad it was only a dream. He turned over, felt the calm of his own bed, and slowly fell peacefully back asleep. The next morning, Robert Jan was awakened by the joyful shouts of his children. They rushed into his room, jumped on the bed, and exclaimed excitedly, "Papa, happy birthday!" Surprised and happy, Robert Jan looked at his family. It was the start of a new, special day. Just as he sat up in bed, his wife and children brought him a tray. On it were a few delicious, fresh rolls with a thick layer of butter and chocolate sprinkles, just the way he liked them best. There was a steaming cup of coffee and a glass of fresh orange juice. The children sang happy birthday at the top of their lungs while his wife smiled warmly. Robert Jan felt a warmth inside. He took a bite of the roll and savored the simple, sweet taste. A small moment of happiness on his birthday. After breakfast, he put on his nicest shirt, suspecting his colleagues might have planned something at work. The weather was beautiful. The sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky with a light, fresh breeze. Together with his wife, he drove the children to school. The windows were slightly open. The children giggled in the back seat, singing happily along with the radio. At school, they all got out, and his children gave him an extra hug. "Happy birthday, Papa," they called before running onto the schoolyard. Then Robert Jan drove on to the town hall. Along the way, he felt light and cheerful. The trees lining the road were full of leaves, and everywhere he saw people smiling, enjoying the lovely weather. He parked his car, grabbed his bag, and walked inside. As he entered the town hall lobby, he noticed something different. Laughter and chatter came from his office. When he opened the door, he was surprised by a loud hip hip hooray from his colleagues. The office was decorated with colorful streamers. Balloons hung from the ceiling, and on the table stood a large festive cake with candles. A sign read, "Congratulations, Robert Jan." His colleagues had clearly put in a lot of effort. There was coffee, party hats, and even a card where everyone had written a personal message. Robert Jan truly felt celebrated and appreciated. Together, they cut the cake, laughed, and shared memories. The workday began joyfully and relaxed, and Robert Jan enjoyed every moment. It was the kind of birthday he loved most. Simple, cozy, with attention to each other, and, of course, a few delicious rolls with chocolate sprinkles to start the day right. That afternoon, because it was his birthday, Robert Jan was allowed to leave work a little early by his colleagues. Feeling happy, he got into the car and drove to his children's school. The sun still shone brightly, and it seemed as if the whole world was a little happier on this special day. At the schoolyard, his children were already waiting impatiently. They ran to him and called out again, "Happy birthday, Papa!" Laughing, he took them home. At home, Robert Jan immediately smelled his favorite scent, hamburgers and fries. His wife had festively set the table, and a cold beer was waiting for him in the kitchen. The children had their favorite soft drinks and were quite hyper from all the celebrations. They jumped around the table, made jokes, and eagerly told stories about their day at school. Dinner was a joyful chaos. There was laughter, fries and ketchup were spilled, and of course loud singing for the birthday boy. Robert Jan visibly enjoyed the togetherness and simple coziness. After dinner, the children played a little more while Robert Jan and his wife cleared the table. When it was time for bed, his wife calmly took the children upstairs. They followed their usual evening routine, pajamas on, teeth brushed, a short story read, and then a big hug. Despite their hyperactivity from all the birthday excitement, they eventually fell asleep contentedly. Downstairs, Robert Jan waited on the couch for his wife. Together, they snuggled under a blanket and turned on his favorite TV series. They watched, laughed, and talked about the day as evening fell and the house slowly grew quiet. Later, Robert Jan quietly climbed into bed. He felt fulfilled and happy. It had been a beautiful and good birthday, full of love, warmth, and small moments of joy. With a smile on his face, he fell into a deep, contented sleep. The next morning, Robert Jan woke in the soft morning light filtering through the bedroom curtains. It was early, around 6:15, but the birds outside were already busy. Their songs mingled with the rustling of leaves in the backyard. The sky was light blue, with a few wisps of clouds here and there, and the scent of wet grass drifted in through the open window. Robert Jan stayed lying still for a moment, listening to the house slowly coming to life. His wife turned over once more, the children still sleeping upstairs, and for a brief moment, the world felt calm and peaceful. Slowly, he slid his legs out of bed, his feet touching the cool laminate floor. He stretched, feeling his muscles relax, and walked leisurely to the bathroom. There, he washed his face with cold water, brushed his teeth, and looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was still tousled, the wrinkles around his eyes soft and kind. Robert Jan smiled. It was a new day again, a day full of small, familiar rituals. Downstairs in the kitchen, the kettle was already bubbling. He poured himself a cup of tea, cracked the window open slightly, and looked outside. In the garden, the roses were in bloom, their flowers red and yellow, and the morning sun made the dew glitter on the blades of grass. A blackbird walked across the lawn, searching for worms. Robert Jan took a sip of tea, felt the warmth spread through his body, and savored the moment. At 7 o'clock, the children came downstairs. They were still sleepy, their hair messy, but their eyes sparkled with anticipation. Breakfast was simple: sandwiches with chocolate sprinkles, a bowl of yogurt, a glass of milk. His wife softly turned on the radio. The news played, followed by a cheerful song. Everyone ate quietly, occasionally interrupted by a joke or a comment about the day ahead. Robert Jan looked at his family and felt content. These were the moments he loved most. After breakfast, it was time to get the children ready for school. Bags were packed, gym clothes checked, coats put on. Shoes stood neatly in a row in the hallway. Coats and scarves hung on the rack. Robert Jan helped his youngest daughter tie her shoelaces, patted his son on the head, and checked that everyone had everything they needed. His wife quickly slipped a note into one of the bags. The children laughed, joked, and were ready for the day. At 7:45, they stepped outside together. The air was fresh, the sun low in the sky casting long shadows over the pavement. The street was quiet, except for a neighbor walking his dog. Robert Jan greeted him warmly, the children ran ahead, jumping over the paving stones and laughing at each other's jokes. The walk to school was short but full of small adventures. A snail on the path, a cat on a garden wall, the scent of freshly cut grass. At the schoolyard, they said goodbye. The children ran through the gate, waved once more, and disappeared into the crowd. Robert Jan walked back home, feeling the morning stillness around him. He took his bike from the shed, checked the tires, and mounted it. The ride to work was a fixed part of his day, a moment of calm and reflection. He rode past trees whose leaves rustled softly in the wind, past gardens full of flowers, past houses where curtains were just being drawn open. The sky was clear, the sun shone on his face, and the world seemed to pause for a moment. Along the bike path by the park, he saw a flock of starlings in the air. They flew in a graceful pattern, their wings shining in the morning light. Among the starlings, he also saw a group of jackdaws, their black feathers glossy, their eyes alert. The birds seemed to follow him, like a silent shadow. Sometimes they landed on a lamppost, only to take off again as he approached. It was as if they accompanied him on his journey, a mysterious company protecting him from the morning silence. By the canal, the water was smooth as glass. In the distance, a heron stood motionless on the bank, waiting for prey. The starlings and jackdaws fluttered around him, their songs mingling with the soft rustle of the wind and the gentle clink of his bike chain. Robert Jan felt calm. His thoughts drifted toward the day ahead. It was an ordinary Monday, but in those ordinary days he found peace. At the town hall, he parked his bike, wiped the saddle dry, and walked inside. The lobby was spacious, with tall windows letting sunlight pour in. The floor was tiled in gray, and a large plant stood in a corner. Robert Jan hung up his coat, grabbed his bag, and walked to his office on the second floor. The stairs were wide, the steps concrete, the walls white and clean. Plants in large pots lined the hallway, and the air smelled of coffee and cleaning fluid. His office was bright, with a large window overlooking the city. Piles of papers lay on his desk, his computer ready to start up. Robert Jan set down his bag, sat down, and looked out the window. Cars moved slowly outside, people hurried to work, the city came to life. He opened his mailbox, read the messages, and began his tasks. Answering emails, checking documents, filling out forms. The work was calm, repetitive, but gave him a sense of certainty. At midday, he drank coffee with his colleagues. They sat together in the canteen, laughed at a joke, talked about the weekend. It was cozy, informal, a moment of relaxation amid the day's busyness. After lunch, he continued working. The hours crept by. Outside, it grew warmer. The sun rose high in the sky and the air was clear blue. At the end of the afternoon, Robert Jan got back on his bike. The ride home was peaceful. The starlings and jackdaws had disappeared, but their presence still echoed in his thoughts. At school, his children were already waiting for him. They ran to him, eagerly told him about their day, and together they cycled home. The air was soft. The sun slowly sank behind the houses, and the shadows grew longer. At home, it was time to cook. Today, it was Robert Jan's turn. Together with the children, he stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, peeling potatoes, frying meat. The kitchen filled with the smell of sautéed onions and herbs. The children helped, joked, and tasted the sauce. It was cozy, messy, just the way he liked it. After dinner, they cleared the table together. The children brought the dishes to the kitchen, and Robert Jan started the dishwasher. Then it was time for the evening routine. Pajamas on, teeth brushed, a little time together in bed talking about the day. Robert Jan read a short story, tucked the children in, and wished them good night. When the house was quiet, Robert Jan climbed into bed himself. He thought back to the birds that morning, the teamwork at work, and the joy of being with his family. Content, he drifted off to sleep ready for a new day. The next morning, Robert Jan awoke to the soft sound of rain tapping on the roof. It was still early. The sky was gray and the room was dim. He stayed lying there for a while, listening to the gentle patter of raindrops, feeling the warmth of the duvet around him. His wife lay beside him, her breathing calm and steady. The children were still asleep and the house was quiet. Slowly, the day began to stir. In the kitchen, Robert Jan switched on the kettle, poured himself a cup of tea and looked outside. The garden was wet. Flowers drooped heavily under the weight of the rain, and the sky was dull and overcast. Robert Jan felt calm, his thoughts slow and languid. It was a day without hurry, a day to take gently. After breakfast, he drove the children to school, the rain still falling softly. The windshield wipers moved rhythmically across the glass. The children pressed their faces against the window, watching the world outside. The school parking lot was busy. Parents hurried inside with umbrellas. Children ran across the wet playground. Robert Jan waved goodbye, waited until his children were safely inside, and then slowly drove back home. At home, he worked at the kitchen table. His laptop was open, papers spread across the surface. Occasionally, he glanced out the window, watching the rain transform the garden into a sparkling carpet of droplets. The hours passed slowly. The quiet of the house broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle tapping of rain. Around midday, the rain stopped, and Robert Jan took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was fresh and clear. The sidewalks were wet, trees dripped with water, and the earth smelled richly of soil and grass. He walked slowly, observing the houses, the gardens, the people walking their dogs. It was peaceful, a moment for quiet reflection. In the afternoon, he picked up the children from school. They were wet, their hair tousled, but their eyes sparkled with joy. At home, they warmed up with cups of hot chocolate. Together, they read a book, played a game, and laughed at each other's jokes. The afternoon flowed gently, the rain tapping softly against the windows. In the evening, his wife cooked. The kitchen filled with the scent of soup, fresh bread was laid on the table, and candles burned softly. The family ate together, talked about their day, and laughed over small moments. After dinner, they cleaned up together. The children took baths, splashing and laughing in the warm water. Before bedtime, Robert Jan read a story. The children listened attentively, their eyes heavy with sleep. He tucked them in, kissed them goodnight, and wished them sweet dreams. Downstairs on the couch, he sipped a cup of tea, listened to the stillness of the house, and felt content. Days passed, each with its own small rituals. Mornings began with tea and bird song, afternoons were filled with work, evenings with family. Sometimes it rained, sometimes the sun shone, sometimes it was quiet, sometimes lively, but always there was the calm of the ordinary, the certainty of the familiar. On Saturday, Robert Jan woke to the sound of children playing in the garden. The sun shone brightly, the sky was clear blue, and the flowers were in full bloom. He prepared a breakfast of fresh croissants, orange juice, and coffee. The family ate together in the garden. The grass felt cool beneath their bare feet, and the air smelled of summer. After breakfast, they made plans for the day. They went to the park, bringing a picnic basket, a blanket, and a ball. The park was busy, children ran across the grass, dogs barked, parents sat on benches in the sun. Robert Jan spread the blanket under a large chestnut tree. The children played, his wife read a book. He looked up at the sky, watching clouds drift slowly by, heard the laughter of his children, and felt the sun warm his face. In the afternoon, they strolled through the park, past the pond where ducks swam, flower beds bursting with color, and trees casting cool shadows on the grass. They gathered chestnuts, searched for interesting stones, shared jokes, and laughed at each other's stories. It was a day without rush, a day full of small moments of happiness. At home, they ate together on the terrace. The sun slowly sank behind the houses, the sky turning soft shades of pink and orange. The children were tired from playing, their cheeks flushed from the sun. After dinner, they tidied up together. The children went to bed early, content and rosy from the day. In the evening, Robert Jan and his wife sat together on the couch. They watched their favorite series, sipped glasses of wine, and talked about the week behind them. Outside, the world grew quiet, the sky darkened, and the first stars appeared. Robert Jan felt calm, content, and grateful for the simple, beautiful days. And so the weeks passed. Each day began with soft morning light, the scent of tea and birdsong. Days were filled with small rituals, work, family, and the rhythm of the seasons. Sometimes something special happened. Sometimes it was ordinary, but always there was the peace of the familiar. Robert Jan found happiness in simplicity, breakfast with his family, the bike ride to work, cooking with the children, reading stories before bed. The days flowed into each other like a slowly flowing river. And each night, as he lay in bed, he listened to the silence of the house, felt the warmth of the duvet, and fell peacefully asleep, ready for another day full of small, ordinary but precious moments. On the next day, Robert Jan woke to a calm, fresh morning. Sunlight streamed in wide beams through the windows, and the garden looked inviting, still wet with dew. After a simple breakfast, he decided to spend the day doing some gardening. The sky was clear blue, blackbirds sang, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered from neighbors who had mowed their lawns the evening before. Robert Jan put on his old jeans, donned a cap against the sun, and walked into the garden with his leaf blower. The trees in his garden were full of leaves, and the first autumn leaves were already drifting down. With slow, thoughtful movements, he blew the leaves into a large, crackling pile. The sun warmed his back, and now and then he paused to take a sip of water and enjoy the view of the flower border, where the last dahlias were still in bloom. As he worked, he suddenly heard the neighbor's gate open. His neighbor, Mr. Van Dyke, came outside. His face looked a little stern. "Robert Jan," he began, "I noticed that yesterday quite a few leaves blew onto my side of the garden. I think you must have blown them over with your leaf blower." His voice sounded a bit irritated, but not unfriendly. Robert Jan felt a slight blush of embarrassment and immediately turned off the leaf blower. "Oh, you're absolutely right, Van Dyke," he said sincerely. "That wasn't my intention. The wind was blowing a bit, and I was so focused I didn't pay attention. Sorry about that." He looked at his neighbor, who crossed his arms but then smiled. Well," said Van Dyke, "it's just leaves. I didn't mean it so badly. It's part of this time of year, isn't it?" Robert Jan laughed with relief. "Let's have a beer to make up for it," he suggested. Van Dyke nodded enthusiastically. Together they walked to the terrace where Robert Jan fetched 2 cold cans of beer from the shed. They sat down on wooden chairs in the sun, the grass still a little damp beneath their feet. The sun warmed their faces, and the beer tasted refreshing after working in the garden. The men chatted quietly about everyday things: the garden, the weather, the children who would soon be playing outside again. Every now and then, they laughed at a story from the street or a memory from long ago. Time seemed to stand still. The sun stood high in the sky, the air was clear, and occasionally a butterfly fluttered by, settling softly on a flower. After the second beer, Robert Jan felt drowsy and relaxed. The warmth of the sun and the gentle rustling of the leaves made him sleepy. He sank a little deeper into his chair, closed his eyes, and listened to the distant sounds of children playing and the soft hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. His neighbor stood up, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "I'm off now, Robert Jan. Have a nice day." Robert Jan mumbled a slow, content reply. The sun warmed his face, the beer tingled pleasantly within him. The scent of earth and grass, the bird song, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees created a soothing backdrop. His breathing deepened. His thoughts flowed gently like ripples on a pond. Slowly, without really noticing, Robert Jan drifted off to sleep there in his own garden, bathed in sunlight. His head rested against the back of the chair, his hands relaxed in his lap. In the distance, a dog barked, A bee buzzed past his ear, but nothing disturbed his deep, peaceful sleep. Time slipped by. The sun slowly moved across the sky, casting warm patterns dancing over the terrace. Robert John slept, surrounded by the soft rhythm of an ordinary, beautiful day. Robert John was awakened by a gentle hand on his shoulder. His wife stood above him, her face half concerned, half amused. "Robert Jan, you're lying here in the middle of the grass," she said with a smile. She looked at the empty beer cans scattered across the lawn. "What's this? Were you partying with Van Dyke?" she asked, shaking her head, but unable to hide her smile. Robert Jan stretched, feeling the sun still warm on his face, and laughed himself. "Oh, it was so nice. Van Dyke came by to complain about the leaves, but in the end we made up with a beer or two. Or three." He looked at the cans and chuckled. His wife laughed out loud. "You do know you still have to fix the shed today, right?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Robert Jan sighed deeply. The thought of the shed, with its sticking doors and cluttered interior, didn't exactly excite him, but he knew it had to be done. Reluctantly, he pulled himself up, gathered the cans, and slowly walked toward the shed. The sun shone brightly on the weathered wood, and the doors hung slightly crooked in their frames. He examined them carefully. The wood had swollen in places from the rain, and the hinges creaked with every movement. He grabbed his toolbox and began loosening the hinges. With a plane, he carefully shaved away some wood from the edge of the door so it would open and close smoothly again. Occasionally, he laid down the plane to wipe the sweat from his forehead as the sun climbed higher in the sky. As he worked, he heard laughter and footsteps behind him. The children came to see what their father was doing. They peeked around the corner of the shed door and asked curiously, "Papa, what are you making?" Robert John explained that he was planing the doors so they wouldn't stick anymore. The children were fascinated to see the curls of wood falling from the plane. They tried to make him laugh with silly faces and jokes, and soon Robert John was smiling broadly, his reluctance replaced by their cheerful company. While he continued working, a group of birds settled on the grass. A blackbird hopped among the leaves searching for worms, while a few sparrows feasted on seeds beneath the hedge. Occasionally, a starling pecked at a fallen apple. Robert John watched them and felt content. The garden was alive, full of small movements and sounds, and he found it beautiful to see nature going about its course. When the doors opened and closed smoothly again, Robert John tidied up his tools. Inside, his wife called that dinner was ready. Together with the children, he walked inside where the table was already set. The evening meal was simple but cozy. A large pot of soup, fresh bread, and a salad from their own garden. They talked about the day, laughed about adventures in the garden, and enjoyed being together. After dinner, everyone helped clean up. The children went upstairs to get ready for bed. Robert Jan took a last stroll through the garden, watching the birds preparing for the night, feeling the calm of the evening settle over him. Then he went upstairs, wished the children good night, and climbed into bed with his wife. Laying his head on the pillow, he thought back on the day. The sunlight, the laughter of his children, the soft chirping of birds, and the feeling of satisfaction after a day working in the garden. With a deep sigh, he fell into a calm, peaceful sleep. Evening gently fell over Robert John's home and family. Outside, the sky slowly shifted from soft orange to deep blue, while in the garden the last birds sang their songs before settling into a sheltered spot for the night. Inside, it was warm and quiet. The house breathed the peace of a day well spent, filled with small, simple moments of happiness. Robert John sat with his wife for a while longer at the kitchen table. They sipped herbal tea and looked out together at the garden bathed in twilight. The children were already in bed upstairs, their voices softly fading away into sleep. Robert John felt the contentment of a day that had gone just right. Work in the garden, the laughter of his children, sharing meals, and the peaceful rhythm of home. He stood up, took one last walk through the house, and peeked into the children's rooms. They lay sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed, hair tousled on the pillows. He gently pulled the duvet a little higher over their shoulders, smiled, and quietly closed the doors. Downstairs, he and his wife turned off the lights together. Hand in hand, they walked upstairs, the stairs creaking softly beneath their feet. In the bedroom, they opened the window slightly to let in the fresh evening air. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the soft hum of a night moth. Robert John slipped under the covers, feeling the warmth of his wife beside him, and closed his eyes. Images of the day drifted through his mind. Sunlight in the garden, the scent of fresh wood, the laughter of his children, and the peaceful feeling of togetherness. He breathed deeply, releasing all tension, and felt grateful for everything. As the night wrapped the house in a soft blanket, Robert Jan fell into a deep, restful sleep. Outside, the first stars glittered in the sky. In the garden, the birds slept, flowers closed their petals, and life slowed to a peaceful, contented rhythm. Thus ended the day for Robert Jan. Simple, warm, and full of love. A day like many others, yet special because of it. A day to cherish, knowing that happiness often lies in the small, quiet moments shared together.